because the Catholic way is we have what I call a passive knowledge of the Bible. So over a 3-year period, we cover almost the entire Bible in the liturgy. But no one, I mean, when I say no one, I mean most of the average Catholics aren't paying attention to where the readings are coming from.
All right, well, welcome back to the For Pete's Sake podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte here, and I'm joined today by John Noronha. He was a former executive at Verizon. He is a professor of technology and theology at the Pontifical Universities here in Rome, and he is a co-founder of the Truth and Beauty Project here in Rome as well. John, welcome to the pod.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. And you have quite the shift of a career, I'd say. I mean, coming to Rome after being, at the head of tech and engineering as your background, it's quite a massive shift. Talk to me about the mentality of why you shifted your studies and shifted your focus in your career midway through, or when people would see, you're sort of at the top of your game, and then you made a big change.
Yeah, it's just so wonderful to look back and see God's providence working in my life, and to think about how when in my childhood, what was most important to me other than fun and games and sports was technology, trying to figure out how things worked. And I even had what we called a Secret 7 club after the Enid Blyton Secret 7 series. But instead of solving crime and mysteries, our job was to bring electrical or electronic products, take them apart, and try to figure out how things work. And we'd get shocks and everything. That would be a badge of honor. But we never figured out how they worked. But that was my passion. And so eventually I went on this fast track towards technology and engineering, focusing primarily on physics, chemistry, math, electronic, computer science. And eventually, God allowed me to reach the highest level of future technology initiatives with Verizon Global. And at that time, I realized two things. Number one, God had used technology to help me get deeper in the faith. Because through a long journey, one of the ways I ended up really getting deeper into my understanding of theology is by getting this digital library of everything possible, hundreds of Bibles and commentaries and church fathers, so I could just click, and get to know the faith in a much deeper way. But also, I had the blessing of being in Birmingham, Alabama, when I worked for Bell South, another telecommunications company, and that's the Bible Belt. And in Bell South, there were so many wonderful Southern Baptists who would ask me about my Catholic faith. And I realized that theological language wasn't really even on the same plane. And so if we had to have a conversation about the faith, I had to learn how to speak the language of chapter and verse. So that really helped me so much. But now I'm in Verizon heading up this technology group, and most of them are either atheists or agnostics, but they wanted to ask me about my faith. And I realized that I didn't even have the vocabulary to explain the faith using purely secular language. So that's when I thought, well, what's the point if I cannot even give an answer for the reason for my faith and hope from 1 Peter 3. And so I thought, well, I need to do something about this. And I had no arts or the humanities in my background. So after wrestling with God for about 1.5 to 2 years, I finally managed to resign from my dream job and ended up pursuing a master's in philosophy, which led to theology, and then eventually came to Rome to do a doctorate in bioethics, and then that led to many other things.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Wow, that's incredible considering the fact that you didn't have any background in the humanities, didn't have any background in a lot of what many people take for granted when it comes to the education they pursue has something to do remotely with their faith. What was it in those conversations that was so difficult to vocalize? You talked about this difference in language in the Bible Belt. What's at the core of that difference? Is Is it the historical context? Is it the early church fathers? What was the conflict between the two when it comes to linguistics there?
So in general, when it comes to a conversation, so a conversation with Catholics will be using sacramental language, theological language. But with a non-Catholic Christian, it's very important to cite the source in the Bible. So, for example, I knew that there was beautiful spirit of continuity. So, for example, in today's reading, there's this beautiful spirit of continuity from the book of Genesis. So when we think about the covenants that God made with Abraham, Romans chapter 4, he talks about Abraham being a father of faith. In Genesis chapter 11, he again uses Abraham as that example of being a witness of faith. But then when you go back to the Old Testament, you see that there's a sequential evolution of his faith. First, in Genesis 12, he's asked to leave the land of Haran, where he's comfortable. He knows everything that it takes to preserve not just himself, but the entire family and the tribe. And then in Genesis 15, another covenant is made with him and God. Genesis 17, not only progeny, but also this fruitfulness that is promised. And then you get to Genesis 22, when he has to make that ultimate test of the faith in sacrificing his own son, Isaac. And so when you look at this progression and you see this beautiful evolution, so I can talk about it as a story without citing a single reference of chapter and verse, and it wouldn't really connect. But as soon as I cite the sources, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 22, and then connect it with Romans 4 and Hebrews chapter 11, that's when you have this connect. Because the Catholic way is we have what I call a passive knowledge of the Bible. So over a 3-year period, we cover almost the entire Bible in the liturgy. But no one, I mean, when I say no one, I mean most of the average Catholics aren't paying attention to where the readings are coming from. So even if it's announced at the beginning, a reading from the book of so-and-so, chapter so-and-so, but no one's really paying attention. And so that's why I thought I cannot expect others to come up or down to my level. It's up to me to learn to speak their language if I want to have a fruitful dialogue.
Yeah.
So that was really helpful. It even changed the way I started looking at the Bible myself and making those connections. And what I did was used my background in engineering. How everything has to be logical, everything has to connect. And I realized that something that I would be convicted with, but have a deep passion for it, would be if I could see how the faith, just like engineering and technology, had continuity without any contradictions. And that's what I was seeking eventually when I left my job in technology and then went into philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. Was it sort of like a reconversion of sort when you made that decision? Was it the final choice of conversion? You know, we talk about people having conversion from another faith to Catholicism, but I think there's also personal conversion where you choose to make the faith your own. And I think everyone has to do that at some point or other. Was that moment for you when you said, this is real and I'm going to make this my life, and it's not something passive that I'm just going to know in passing. I'm going to actively know it and act upon it as well. Was that moment for you?
Yeah, this is such a great question, Charlotte, because in my life, now looking back, I see how there were multiple moments of conversion. And so even if it's called a reversion, so growing up, I went to Mass, I was an altar server, did everything, but really didn't have any ownership of my faith. And I also grew up in this Catholic bubble, to the point where we also have a recreational club, like a country club, but it's exclusively for Catholics. And I'm convinced that every diocese should have a Catholic club because people go to different parishes and don't get to know each other. But in general, after, let's say, the Christmas vigil or the Easter vigil, people go to different parishes, but then everyone converges at the Catholic club after that. So it was this Catholic bubble. I went to a Catholic school for over 10 years. And then after that, when I went to a secular engineering college, I realized that I wasn't prepared to now give answers for my faith, which I was never challenged on. I've done so many years of theology and I should know the answers. But when I was actually challenged by some of these professors who came to give guest lectures and said, oh, religion is a crutch. You don't need religion now that we have science. I thought I could actually answer these questions, and I realized I couldn't. To the point where I was actually losing hope in the very truths of the faith, because I had many priest friends, some of whom were teaching at a local seminary. So I went to them and asked them, so Father, what are the answers to these questions? And I wasn't getting the answers. So they would give me like anecdotes and stories and things. And I said, well, that could work for me, but not for these really hardcore rationalist professors. So I actually went home one weekend from college to visit my family. And my dad was one of these very strict disciplinarians. And he always said under his roof, his rules applied. And if we were not happy with the rules, we didn't have to be under his roof. So it meant that even though I was away from home and coming back to visit, that the rules applied. And one of the rules was that we all went as a family to the 8:30 a.m. Mass. And we couldn't be late. So even though it was just a 5-minute drive, he wanted to get there early. And it actually kind of makes sense because you don't show up to a soccer game and just start playing without warming up. And so it was about 7:45, and I was at the breakfast table in my pajamas. So he came down the windy stairway and gave me that look, and I said, no, I'm not going to make you all late. I'm not going to Mass. He said, well, first of all, who said you have the option? But just out of curiosity, why are you thinking of not going to Mass? So I told him what happened with the professors and the priests not being able to give me answers. And I thought that was good enough. And he said, that's the dumbest reason I've heard. And he said, if you have a problem with a physics professor about gravity or something, I hope as a good student, you won't just check out of the program, but actually go to the library and do your research and your due diligence and figure out the answers. And he said, when it comes to your faith, why are you expecting to be spoon-fed by the priests? And he gave me 4 minutes to change, polish my shoes, and come down, be ready to leave. And as I was hustling to get ready, I was actually allowing it to sink in that for other things, I was willing to do the hard work and due diligence.
Right.
But with my faith, I was expecting to be spoon-fed by the priests.
Right.
So that was one of my initial challenges. And I said, well, okay, I have to start looking at not just the truth of Christianity, but just looking into what is truth. And so I started any free time I had looking into what these different propositions of truth were. And then after a long journey, ended up coming right back to Christianity. And then among all the Christian denominations, then it was Catholic. But by this time, I had ownership of my faith. But there were several other moments where I had these deep, very profound experiences. So at this point, it was just like the culmination of many.
Right.
And I think that's why so many people, sometimes you have one dramatic experience, but in my life, it was many that kind of built up to this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Conversion is sort of a choice you make on the day-to-day as well. So that makes sense. There were so many different moments. And what a beautiful quote from your father. It's so amazing. Don't be spoon-fed by priests. It's a great line.
Yeah.
I'll take it into my personal life. Wow, that's incredible. And so you went then to philosophy and theology, and then eventually finalizing with focusing doctorate-wise in bioethics. What was it about bioethics that you felt called to specialize in?
I think for me, it was the realization that when I switched to philosophy, that was the most difficult academic exercise for me, because in technology, everything's mathematical and it all adds up. But in philosophy, here I was dealing with abstract concepts that are not sensible, measurable, nor always demonstrable. And so it was not easy for me. It was only maybe into my second semester that things started making sense. So eventually, once I ended up really understanding how philosophy, the love of wisdom, was the pursuit of actually first understanding your terms. So again, unlike mathematical definitions, even simple things love, joy, goodness,
Mm-hmm.
beatitude, all of these things had so many different layers attached to it, and not just conversation or colloquial meanings. And different philosophers use the same terms in different ways. So, with that, it was so helpful to now have a completely new understanding of theology. It was almost like I was starting theology from scratch, even though I had already done so much of research on my own. But eventually, when I was done with my master's in theology, I realized that bioethics was the perfect synthesis, not only of philosophy and technology, but also I realized how, in the advances in technology that were now at this point changing technology so fast at such a fast pace,
Mm-hmm.
and those on the technology side kind of cared about ethics and doing things that were morally right. But if they wanted to ask an ethicist what the underlying principles were, those on the philosophical or ethical side didn't actually have an understanding of technology.
Right, right.
So this way, I felt it could be a wonderful way to bridge the fields of philosophical ethics with technology, and also having come from a management role where I understood how, at the end of the day, for any leader in technology, uh, being responsible to the shareholders and others. So if it's not profitable, then there's no point in even venturing into
Mm-hmm.
that new aspect of technology. So
Mm-hmm.
finding the balance between something that's profitable, something that's truly good for the human person, and something that's ethically worthwhile pursuing, and being that bridge between the two sides to understand the technology side and the ethics side.
Yeah,
So that's how I found it a perfect match.
not an easy task.
Yeah, but it's fun because to keep up with the constant evolution
Yeah.
of changes now that are going at this galloping rate.
I mean, so
so-
quickly.
Exactly, yeah.
What do you see as being the area that's developing the quickest? I mean, obviously we have AI, and Pope Leo has brought that to the forefront of the moral technological conversation. But I think there are other ones, especially in bioethics, that aren't being spoken about nearly as much. You know, the developments in so many different, biofields, especially pertaining to human dignity and things of that sort. What are some areas that you see that aren't being spoken about?
So in addition to AI, so also the idea of transgenderism, transhumanism, and a lot of these go back to a misunderstanding of metaphysics. So that's why, in my pursuit of understanding theology, what I thought I knew, I realized that I really had not even a fraction of the theological understanding until not just the philosophy, but also anthropology and metaphysics was able to bridge the gap of truly understanding the human person. And then one understands who the human person is, then the idea of the trillion-dollar industry of happiness. And so trying to figure out what leads to happiness or
Right.
human fulfillment. And that could be seen in an immediate or a temporal or a remote or an ultimate sense. And so that's why beginning with metaphysics and then anthropology before helping people even get to a dialogue of these very complex bioethical principles is where I feel that the discussion goes, instead of beginning at the foundations, it goes directly to the superficial. What are the more immediate pressing issues? And that's why it seems like there's no comprehensive understanding, and those who on either sides are just standing firmly with their positions.
Right.
And that's why I feel a better way to do it would be to have some kind of either conferences or presentations of what makes the human person human with this dignity, what gives a human person this dignity, and then how this human nature can be fulfilled across all of humanity. So that's why I think, to your question, all of these new developments in technology, if the understanding is, well, certain things are good, but so it's not just about what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
If it is possible and if it is good, And then for those who are getting into it, if it's profitable for everyone, then that's what should be considered. But
Right.
otherwise, just keeping up with something because it could be profitable and it could be popular, that seems to be the current trend now.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that's the education problem that's at the core of it? That in the U.S. in particular, we sort of pushed philosophy to the side. That in modernism and postmodernism, even the idea of philosophy sort of falls apart because you lose the idea of universal truths. So it's very difficult to begin dialectic or conversations of any sort without the idea of universal truths. Do you think that's the core of the technological problem too? Because you're going to always push for what's possible, not for what's good necessarily.
Yeah, so having been brought up in the British system where you're not required to take any course in the humanities or liberal arts, as opposed to the American system where you are required to take a certain number of credits in the humanities and liberal arts. So after having the basics of philosophy, when I spoke to so many of the American philosophers, I realized that we were on different planes altogether. So in the American system, it's not just that they need to have philosophy, and psychology is also very popular in the American education system, but it all depends on what kind of foundational principles are taught in these philosophical programs and who is teaching them. So that's why I think that, so take for example, someone can try to read the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, but if you go in cold and you don't even know what he means by substance and accidents, how that corresponds to what St. Augustine said, and how Augustine is also using a Neoplatonic concept. And then if you go back to the Aristotelian, then when you read St. Thomas Aquinas, you know exactly what he means by even basic terms. Love, fulfillment, joy, substance, accident. So that's why it's so important to have a gradual progression. So in my philosophy, it was so great because we started with the pre-Socratics. And then we came to the early Greek philosophers. And then eventually we only got to the Christian philosophers, let's say in the middle of the second semester. But if I directly gone into even Augustine, it is so complex and it is so profound that one could just read and get something out of it superficially, but to really get the more deep, profound realities, one has to do a little bit of due diligence to understand what they even mean when they are writing about certain things, just matter-of-factly.
Yeah, absolutely. So you grew up in the English system that does, because like I'm thinking public education, I'm thinking like high school level education, because once you go to university, you have 13 million options in the entire world. So you're not going to be able on a government level to determine that. But on the high school level in the UK, it's no humanities required for all lower education, or is it, or is you have to learn how to read?
Yeah, so the reading is already kind of proficient by the 4th or 5th grade. And so by the time we get to the 10th grade, in our final, whether it's for history or geography or the sciences, or you have to pick between either going into computers or biology, but we have to actually, for our final exam, cover everything from the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade syllabus. But soon after the 10th grade, you have to choose whether you're going on to the medical track, in which case you take more biology, or if you're going into the engineering track, PCME, physics, chemistry, math, electronics is what I picked, or if you're going into commerce and going into accounting and economics and everything, or if you're going into law. And so by the 10th grade, you make these choices, and that determines the courses and the structure that you're going to follow after that.
Got it.
So by the time we get to our first semester of engineering, we've already done the most advanced calculus and physics and chemistry. So we've already done organic chemistry, analytical chemistry, biochemistry. So that in our engineering program in the first year, it's an application rather than studying the basics of the mathematics and physics and chemistry and everything.
Wow, that's so interesting, because in the U.S. system, we really don't have a course set up that way. It's sort of free for all as far as your course work and load in the public education system. And I imagine that benefits stem to quite a certain extent because of how advanced you are by the time you get onto that, final decision as to what course you're going to take. But then I wonder if once you're stuck in that and you want to move out or expand it all, you're sort of set there. Well, then I need to maybe join an extracurricular club about philosophy instead of actually being able to take a class on it. So interesting. So then this makes sense as to why you worked on the Papal Reform Commission also, thinking about this educational aspect and being able to teach that balance between profitable, fulfilling, and popular in layman's terms. So what was that experience like going through and analyzing with, I think it was 8 to 10 other people, wasn't it, on that Papal Commission, and going through everything? What was that experience like, and how did you feel like your background was really fit into that?
Yeah, so this was when Pope Francis, at the beginning of his term, wanted to look into how to reform the church. And the requirement, in addition to the other experts, former finance ministers and heads of different companies. And what was required as part of this was someone who had a background both in the corporate world, but also in theology and understood the working of the Vatican. So that was fascinating because being privy to so much of what was going on. And that really helped to build my faith, to see how the Holy Spirit protected the church for all of these almost 2,000 years, despite the fact that, so take for example, when a priest becomes a pastor, most often he doesn't have a background in accounting, in human resources, in handling just basic management of a parish, which is in the United States sometimes a multi-million-dollar affair, but he is still in charge of everything. And so whether it's priests or bishops or cardinals and eventually the Pope, they're put into these positions, and managing the Catholic Church of over 1 billion people in so many different countries, that is just mind-blowing. And so that's what really helped to really boost my faith. And it was a privilege for me to contribute in whatever way I can. But at that time, I did feel like my background helped me in really being able to assess not just what was a utopian idea of being like this perfect spirit of administering an organization where everything is running smoothly, but the idea of, with the system that we have, how can we make the best of it? Mm-hmm. And so that again is the same approach, whether it's in bioethics or anything else, doing an analysis of what the current situation is, and then with what we have, what is the best way to make it the most successful, not just to make things work, but to make them thrive to the best of its ability, and then make proposals.
I always say that it was very fitting timing-wise, and obviously the Holy Spirit was looking out for everyone at that time, but there was a lot of worry about, well, when you have these people in these commissions, their personalities start getting fired up, and then there's going to be egos fighting, and there's going to be clashing. But everyone I've spoken to speaks to the same experience, where there was an end goal different than yourselves that you all completely agreed upon, and so there weren't as many issues. Did you find that to be the case as well in this commission, that everyone from the very beginning, started off at the same end goal, and so you, even though you're coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different worldviews in many ways, there's a unifying aspect to that?
Yeah, so there's the unifying aspect, and then there's the human aspect. And so that's why it's basically just the state of our human condition. And that's why it's just so beautiful to see how within the church you have so many amazing, well-intentioned projects and everything. But then our humanity gets in the way. And so that's why it's just so evident that the Holy Spirit is building up and protecting the church. So despite everything that goes on, it could be a church-based organization or a totally secular organization, mm-hmm. but humanity still gets in the way. Mm-hmm. And so that's why what we see now. So when we go back to, this is why history and the Bible is so important, because you look at the great patriarchs. Abraham is epitome of faith.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about.
Mm-hmm.
But then when he went to Egypt in Genesis 13, he asked Sarah to lie,
Mm-hmm.
that she is his sister and not his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Similar with Isaac, we see with Moses. After God helped Moses to part the sea when they needed food, manna from heaven, and then quail when they wanted meat.
Mm-hmm.
And through everything, God led him with a mighty hand. And then eventually, with the next water problem, with the next generation of Israelites in Numbers 20, when he told Moses to speak to the rock and he would take care of it. And Moses, with his lack of faith, struck the rock twice. And so we see this across the history of our patriarchs and then coming to the new covenant. So that's why it is so helpful and so, I guess, motivating to see how all of us individually or collectively have our gifts and talents, but also our weaknesses. And that's why when we have the ability to recognize our weaknesses, so like Socrates saying, he was wise because he knew more than anyone else how much he didn't know. So I guess in a spiritual sense, if we see how we can be spiritually wise, if we know how human and how fallen we are, and then we will seek to get God's grace more.
Yeah.
And that's why I think so many commissions in the church, those who are rooted in prayer, and I guess making the spiritual element more important, those tend to thrive. And those tend to be successful. And then when you have another crisis, then other solutions, but always calling on the grace of God. And prayer is, I guess, the capstone of everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that quote, the Catholic Church has to be real because no other Italian organization could last for this long.
Exactly. Not even 2 years, let alone
Yeah,
2,000
exactly.
years.
Yeah. It has to be protected. There's no other reason that something would last that long, given the human aspect. No, it's so true. And it's so interesting that you came to Rome amidst all of this, and then you've been a part of so many massive projects, and not the least of which is your Truth and Beauty project with your wife Ashley. In a time where truth is a very difficult conversation, the avenue of beauty can be a great avenue to reach so many people who perhaps wouldn't have been reached through just conversation. Again, that linguistic problem where you're speaking different languages from half the people you interact as a Catholic. What was your experience in that coming about, and what have you found since developing it in your personal life? Has there been any big changes for you?
Yeah, it's been huge because it all came about literally through Ashley waking me up at 4:30 one morning and shaking me out of my sleep and saying, "I've got it, the Truth and Beauty project." And I said, "The what?" And she said, "I can just see it." And I said, "Well, what's this going to be?" And she said, "Well, I don't know exactly what the specifics are, but I just feel that we are called to really spread the truth using beauty as the most important way to attract people, because truth is, for different people, sometimes it's relative, but beauty seems to be something that people universally accept as something that really takes you out of yourself. And so that too evolves. But the basic idea behind that was the same series of conversions that I had, or reversions that I had. The idea that now we have a way of integrating so many different disciplines in order to help people understand that the truth has to be, what I said, have continuity and no contradiction across all the different disciplines. It cannot be just true theologically, but not true philosophically or mathematically. So it's this beautiful continuity across the board. And then one of the priests, basically a few weeks before that, kind of challenged us, and he said, "Why is it that only those who are privileged to come to Rome to study at the Pontifical or American universities have access to this kind of education? And why not make it available to everyone and have this beautiful spirit of integrating all the disciplines, but doing it in a practical way?" So all that was figured out by Ashley over time. And it's just beautiful to see how both of our personalities and gifts came together. And because her expertise is communications, media training, conflict resolution, and crisis management. And there's no one in the world who doesn't have conflict and crises to manage. And so she came up with this curriculum where it's not only understanding the truths of the faith with church fathers, metaphysics, philosophy, theology, scripture, and liturgy and everything, but also the question was, how can we make things practical for those who have now understood what virtue is and that it has to be pursued, but what are the practical ways to live out a life of virtue with the support of the community, but also giving them the skills of effective communication, leadership skills, psychological understanding of how we work. And then now having the support through a mentoring program, and then being able to have a mentorship program where they continue what they started here on a personal level to grow personally in virtue, but also to spread the ripple effect. And so, so it's just, again, looking back and seeing how Providence basically helped us. And then we couldn't keep this to ourselves. So it's just as we ask others who experience the program to pay it forward. So I guess this is our way of paying it forward too.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So wonderful. Well, thank you for being on today, John. It's been a pleasure to have you. We finish off all of our For Pete's Sake podcasts the same way, and that's with our rapid fire round.
Okay.
So these are just a few fun questions to finish off the episode, but thank you again for coming on.
Oh, it's been a joy.
All right, rapid fire round. John, are you ready?
Okay.
Okay. Question number 1, favorite pope of all time?
That's tricky. I guess Gregory the Great.
What great choice. Great choice. Fantastic choice. He's in the Basilica, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
He is, yeah. So you
because
get to
he
go
had
see
be a
him all the time.
Yeah, great spiritual and civic leader. So that's what makes him so exceptional.
Amazing, amazing. Underrated saint, in your opinion?
Philip Neri.
Yeah. He's also in Rome.
Exactly.
All the Roman ones. I love it. Favorite fact about the Vatican that you're allowed to tell me?
That in the Vatican, those who actually get to go and see the bones of Peter in the Scavi are never the same again.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then the most Catholic country, in your opinion?
I think it's, even though it's not a Catholic country, I think Hungary would be that country for all the policies that they are actually really implementing, not just as thoughts, but actually implementing in policy.
In the practical. Yeah, love it. And then finally, thank you again for coming on today, John. Finish this sentence. For Pete's sake, I wish people would just
turn to God and repent and prepare the way for the Lord to come into their hearts.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on,
welcome.
John. This has been For Pete's Sake, the podcast. Join us next week for our next episode. And if you liked this podcast, feel free to like and subscribe.